you very much for that generous introduction. Namaha Sabhai. Good afternoon to one and all. Namaskar, Namaskaram, Malikum Salam, Namaste, Sat Sri Akal. And by now, you are all perhaps wondering why I'm addressing you and greeting you in these various forms. Well, this is something to do with the insights that I got after reading B.D. Chattopadhyaya's book representing the other Sanskrit sources on the Muslims, namely that languages as means of communication interpenetrated and created social spaces for interaction. The examples that he gave therein are of how Sanskrit adapted to Arabic words and vice versa in the inscriptions that he studied and referred to in this book. Of course, in final analysis, particular identities do not disappear, but at pertinent historical moments, such changes are affected that enable social and cultural interaction. As most of you are aware, there was always a continuous learning process when it came to interactions with Professor Chattopadhyaya. I am most grateful to the Department of Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology at Visva-Bharati for inviting me to deliver the third Professor B.D. Chattopadhyaya Memorial Lecture, a scholar who I admired not only for his scholarly pursuits, but also his genuine and humane interactions. I was neither his formal student nor his colleague. However, it was through our writings and meetings from time to time that we realized that we share much in common about doing history in a particular way. Today, I focus on a theme that Professor Chattopadhyaya wrote about in various innovative ways, and one of those was teaching us how we should closely look at landscape changes that then get reflected in suffixes and prefixes of words used to describe settlements people inhabited over historical time. So let me begin. A phrase from the Rig Veda and also found in the Shukla Yajurveda tells us, Vanani na prajata hitantana, meaning the forest should not be destroyed. The above sentiment has been integral to the Indian subcontinent's earliest understanding of the necessity of having a balanced view of nature. In fact, in the same text, the Aranyani Sukta personifies the forest as a goddess and worships it to see it as a space that enriches humankind. Indeed, these are poetic articulations and part of the experiential sensibilities of the sages who visualized the natural environment around them, but clearly also saw it as a productive resource that must have been found in ample presence around them. Thus, at the same time, there is a Kshetrapati Sukta in the same text that invokes the lord of the Kshetra, that is field, which was also meant to make humans prosper and nourish them with plant staples. However, in this case, humans were meant to generate plant life with care to increase agricultural productivity. Not very much later, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad compares the human form to being similar to a plant, thus seeing the inseparability of life forms. It reads thus, a man is indeed like a mighty plant. His hairs are its leaves, his skin is its outer bark. The blood flows from the skin of the man, so does the sap from the skin of the plant. Thus, blood flows from a wounded man in the same manner as the sap from a plant when it is chopped. It is this intense urge to protect both forest and field for different reasons that becomes a desirable goal to be reckoned with by all states and societies in early India. However, at the same time, in the process of doing so, tensions and contradictions were created between the Vana, forest, generally understood as a forest, and the Kshetra field through historical time. So in this lecture, I reflect on the gradual and complex ways in which these different ecological environments were transformed, or at least suggest ways in which perhaps we can think about reading the sources with regard to them. My focus today shall be on understanding the survival and domestication, in particular of the term Vana, that I argue was dependent on the trajectory of how the urban dweller and the agrarian populations interacted with forest peoples and communities from time to time in different locations. And of course, I must admit over here that I draw on my earlier work, one loosely looking at how boundaries of regions necessarily evolved to define exclusions of primarily mountainous and forested regions of the subcontinent. And of course, I have in mind my work on the notion of the Mleccha in early India, where I had discussed this briefly. And second, more recently, I've argued in a couple of articles that we need to differentiate different types of landscapes that we denote by the by the term forest in the English language, and interrogate the meaning of various terms which are used to describe what I call forest-like environments in relationship to non-forest spaces. I shall also bring in a focus or a discussion of social groups that inhabited these spaces, because they have the much needed knowledge about forest produce and its resources. With the emergence of the state initiative and subsequently the collation of instructive manuals on agriculture as well as texts dealing with medicine, the forest became an active space to be acquired or transformed. Primarily in the second half of this lecture, I will share with you the ways in which I interrogate the terminologies that were used for the forest, settlements, place names, borders, etc. And these, of course, I draw upon various sources, texts and inscriptions, of course, and a little bit, a few insights from anthropology and archaeology as well. Ultimately, it is the particularity of landscapes interconnected with each other, which I suggest provide several dimensions of the earlier socio-environmental history of forests, gardens, fields on the subcontinent. So I begin with forest peoples and borderlands. And as you are all aware, the perception of the forest dweller is absent for early periods of Indian history. Therefore, what I do briefly below is I take a brief look at some of the earliest texts that throw light on an engagement with them in various contexts. Ever since the time that oral narratives through memory encased in texts emerge as sources for getting glimpses into the subcontinent's past, the nishadas, a generic term to describe groups of hunters and fishermen, came to be referred to as an important forest people, among whom the non-forest people had to perform. For example, the changing ideas about Aryavarth that gives us injunctions about how the Aryas should avoid certain kinds of territory. Similarly, just one second. Yeah. Is there some problem in getting across to all of you?
No, it's
or
fine.
Is it fine?
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple of seconds we got disconnected. Now it's all right.
Sorry?
For a couple of seconds we lost the internet connection. Now it's all right.
Okay. No, my connection is fine.
It happened from our side.
Okay. So would you like me to repeat that portion, or I just proceed further?
Actually, students have missed, man. For just 2 minutes maximum. The point, if you can say the point, what you said, that would be great.
Okay. So the point that the point that I was making was that in terms of looking at the relationship of the non-forest people with the forest people, in the earlier texts, the relationship is much more closer, and therefore they participate in many of the rituals of the early Vedic society. However, the interaction of particular social groups varies. Some of them are pushed further into the forested areas or further away from the mainstream society, while others adjust to it and become part of the Varna Jati system, and many others remain outside it. However, we don't get this information from the perception of the forest dwellers per se, but we get this information from texts that are engaging with their own experiences of discovering the forested lands, right? And therefore, I give some examples of the close relationship that let's say even the narrator of the Mahabharata, Vyasa, has with the Nishadi fisherwoman. Similarly, Eklavya's story, and there are many other such narrative traditions that we have in the epics that can be drawn upon to see this relationship, which I'm not discussing too much in detail, except to say that borderlands were what we talk about as the present view of the Ganges Valley. These forested peoples were inhabiting that area at one point in time. And over a period of time, of course, they are further pushed into the recesses of deep into the Vindhyan regions or into the Himalayan regions. And therefore, the prescriptive literature, and that is where I had come to, that the prescriptive literature, like the Dharma Sutras and the Dharma Shastras, they talk about what is the notion of Aryavarth. But whenever they're describing what is Aryavarth, they use the analogy of the black antelope, and they argue that the black antelope naturally roams around those areas which can be grazed, which are well cultivated, and excludes from its roaming areas which are sandy, mountainous, or forested. And as a result, sacrifice cannot be performed in those mountainous and sandy areas. And that, of course, gives a perception of what they think as poor land. Similarly, the Buddhist texts also have a notion of what they call Majjhima Desh, in which the central feature is that the best areas where you can learn or acquire knowledge are these well-cultivated plains of India, and so therefore they give a definition of Majjhima Desh, where the eastern boundaries is demarcated by a place called Ka Jangala. So the Jangala is the borderline. In the Aryavarta descriptions, Kalatavana. So Vana, the forest, is again the borderline where the pure land ends and so-called impure land begins. In fact, it is in the Jain texts that there is a very clear demarcation of territory inhabited. They say very clearly in their commentaries of the 5th century CE that the territory inhabited by indigenous peoples like the Varvara, Shabara, Pulinda, these areas should not be visited by monks and nuns because they were not very conducive, they were violent, they were full of wild animals, and these were areas not to be visited. So much so that in the Jataka stories, the forest dweller is depicted as some kind of a frightening person for the city dwellers who run away from him in terror. So I have briefly kind of introduced you to the idea that forest peoples have engaged with what we so-called civilization for a very, very long period on the subcontinent. However, we generalize what we understand by forest. So now I'm going to proceed with discussing with you the main focus of my interest, and that is terminologies that we use to describe what in the English language we call forest, but I use the word the dynamic vana. And I have interrogated this term in some of the articles that I have written. And there are various, there are various terms that are used to define different kinds of forests. There's vana, of course, there's upavana, there's aranya, there's Atavika, Vatika, Arama, and if you glean through some of the dictionaries like the Amar Kosh or prescriptive texts like the Arthashastra, you get a lot of information. So the Vana of all these terms, Vana was the most frequently used to define multiple spaces that we refer to in the English language, sometimes as forests, sometimes woods, sometimes groves, sometimes thickets, and even a considerable number of plants growing in a thick cluster. So, for example, in the Amar Kosh gives us a kind of genealogy and says that Vana was used to describe even a single tree. This is the meaning he gets from the Katha Sarita Sagar. Or even earlier, Vana was used to explain a foreign or distant land, and he draws upon the Rig Veda to get this meaning. At the same time, again, if we go back to the epics, we are told about vana being a suffix for many forests that the Ramayana, for example, refers to, the Chitrakuta vana. But then they also have Dandaka Aranya, Panchavati vana, and these are identified with different suffixes. So it raises here the question that what do these suffixes really mean, Maharanya or Aranya? In some cases, Aranya and Vana have an element of wild that is attached to them. However, in some other usages, the Aranya is usually refers to a very large area meant for protection, cultivation and preservation of medicinal plants by indigenous inhabitants of the forest. So in the Arthashastra, there's a very interesting reference to the Aranyachara, who are referred to as human populations that had to have a close association with forests, but who were accessible. So for example, they say that Kautilya says that the Aranyachara were to guard the territory between the fortress and the frontier of the kingdom, along with groups like the Shabaras, Pulindas, Chandalas, and the officials of the state were instructed to make arrangements within the boundary of the forest area for settlement of foresters connected with the produce of forest to preserve it and to protect it. So in these contexts, the terms that are referred to in these texts are not really referring to a distant forest. Both Vana and Aranya are actually referring to enclosures of forested areas close by settlements. However, it cannot be ignored that the word Atavika or Atvi is always used to describe a wild or barbarian area. Often it's suffixed with the term Mlecha or Mlecha Atavika as Mlecha Atavika. And these people are supposed to be engaged in attacking and robbing people. And therefore these are areas supposed to be avoided. They are also visualized as people with great strength, so much so that there is an Atavi Bala or a kind of a limb of the army that Kautilya advocates there should be. It has been pointed out that there's another word called Shrivana, which alluded to forest, to the dense forest, which was considered the property of tribes and peoples which alluded to the property of tribes, and people from other Janapadas could not claim ownership to these protected lands. So these lands in the Shrivana had to be monitored and protected by the tribal village communities, as their livelihoods depended on the forest. A verse from the Mahabharata rings a very contemporary tone on the protection of forests, and I quote, "Do not destroy the forests and tigers, and do not make forests devoid of tigers. Forests cannot be saved without tigers, and tigers cannot live without forests, because forests protect tigers and tigers protect forests," unquote. Creating forests for produce was a central theme in several texts, and we have details again from the Arthashastra where officials had to gather knowledge of the so-called plantation of new forests, establishing new villages with instructions that the boundary of these villages should be marked by a forest and trees. They also had to set up special type of animal forests, and various types of animals were to be given shelter on land which was not suitable for agriculture, and so on and so forth. So if you look at there is a difference between each of these terms to define different types of forests, but to my mind, it was this organic link between the non-agrarian but yet tracts that provided a variety of products for consumption and use that defined the interactive space between the truly wild forest and the city, a vast ambiguous zone that could best be captured with the use of the suffix vana, defined critically by a prefix to indicate specificity. The natural forest became the domesticated forest, and then the exploited forest, giving way ultimately to only identifiable clusters of trees once civilization/urbanization emerged in key select cultivated areas. Now, I'll take one example. These are some general thoughts as I said, I had already written about this. Maybe I can, share the references to this part with you. But I'll take one example of one of the ways in which this term vana elucidates for us the close relationship between a natural forest and one that came to be established and signified by the word upavana. Like, I think some of you know upavana usually we use to describe a garden. But no, if you draw on texts which deal with the knowledge system of the Vriksha Ayurveda, the Ayurveda of Vrikshas, trees, which is, of course, these days available in all Indian languages. A very important or pertinent discussion is the process called Upavana Kriya. Which was to replicate the products of the forest near agrarian tracts and also protect these products for their use in the traditional system of Ayurvedic medicine. Our attention is drawn to the Nirukta of Yaska again, an 8th century BCE text on etymology that describes Upavana as Upamitam Vanena, meaning that which, quote unquote, mimics the forest. The Amarkosh, which again I had already referred to, defines it as Krithri Mamam Vana, meaning an artificial forest or an arama or garden. Now, Upavanam had other synonyms in the Vriksha Ayurveda text, such as Kshetravanam, literally agricultural forest. That is one that has element of multi-crop agroforestry. That upavana has been commonly used to mean garden, and this must necessarily be differentiated from other words for garden, like udyanam or vatika, etc., is something that the Brihat Samhita, another 5th century CE text, suggests that we need to differentiate. There is a subtle difference between using upavana for garden in general or its use for garden and agroforest, because this was sacred. It needed to be planted first in temples and then gardens and then homes, because the upavana or kshetravanam needed certain kinds of lands and was very different from the lands that were needed for fields. So, for example, the kshetravanam needed normal dry lands and rain-fed water, while the kshetra lands needed wet lands and irrigated water. So this is a very clear distinction between when we are using the term upavana for agroforestry, and that should be differentiated from kshetra lands which used irrigated water. Zimmerman, in his writings based on how traditional medicine practices evolved, has also brought to our notice the differentiation of forest landscapes between jangala or dry areas and anupa or marshy areas. The former was healthy land, fertile, with the potential of being cleared for cultivation. The latter, on the other hand, were unhealthy, and therefore the animals of these regions were not conducive for use in medical substances. In addition, the Upavana Vinoda, a text of the 13th century, has detailed that Upavanam as agroforestry was that critical space that had to be used for growing medicinal plants within a multi-crop pattern that was typical of the Upavana model that mimics the forest environment. It is further pointed out in all ancient languages of India, a distinct word is used to denote agroforest. As for instance, in Tamil, it is known as Vayala Kadu, Vayala meaning agricultural field and Kadu meaning forest. Now, the necessity of highlighting the above features of Upavanam is in some detail is to emphasize that agrarian communities were always in contact with these forest spaces, and many of the medical texts that codified this knowledge over a period of time insightfully point out how this information was accessed from tribal and pastoral people who had retained plant names, etc., in their vernaculars. Some prominent Ayurvedic scholars noted in their texts the contribution of tribal knowledge on the cultivating practices in agroforestry, while other writers of Ayurvedic texts clearly noted that medicinal plant names and their identification was known only among shepherds, cowherds, hermits, and forest dwellers, which the Vaidyas were encouraged to learn from. So this harks back to an earlier discussion that some of the forest people were always in close contact, of course, for different reasons, in different localities and at different levels of cohabitation. Now, let me come to the main part of what I want to share with you, and that is about forests and the making of settlements. So, based primarily on literary sources, earlier scholarship, and I have in mind Charles Malmood, Brian Smith, and others, have tended to contrast the Aranya forest as the other of the grama or settled village, or they have looked at the Vana forest as being understood in opposition to the Kshetra settlement. In most of these views, except those of Sontheimer, the German scholar Sontheimer, the settlement of agrarian village is dramatically contrasted with the unsettled forest area in binary terms without considering a possible intervening interactive space. So Sontheimer's significant insights, however, brought forth an understanding of the way pastoral communities and their cults navigated both these spaces. Studying mainly the Deccan regions, his large concern was to see the link between the forest and the settlement to explain movement of pastoral communities and how their practices and religious cults straddled different spaces and communities. More recently, considering that there were more pragmatic needs of all the communities, Shirin Ratnagar has pointedly stated, and I quote, while there could be conceptual distinction between Grama or Janapada on the one hand and Aranya on the other, it cannot mark a land use distinction. Forests would have been the niche for not only hunter-gatherers and hermitages, but also a valuable resource for peasants, iron smelters, and pastoralists, unquote. In bringing in a discussion of pastoral environments, it is our submission that in the different regions and localities of the subcontinent, there was an ongoing process entailing that peoples and inhabitants lived in a dependent relationship for which the pastoralists, being both partially settled and nomadic, played a crucial role at all levels: social, economic, political, and of course cultural. We cannot, of course, address all these issues in the present lecture, but briefly, how domestication of those spaces, forests, grasslands, agricultural fields, associated with the term or designated by the term Vana in literature, reflects on how there was a complex process of change and survival, often in coexisting modes of habitation. Now, some insights from ethnographic studies among pastoral communities affirm that a continuous and well-established relationship between them and agricultural communities on one hand and with the forest dwellers on the other was a necessity, though not always in harmony. Sometimes these relationships have been described as symbiotic, especially in the semi-arid regions of the Deccan. It is argued agriculture could never replace pastoralism, though agro-pastoralism could prevail in the dry regions where either of the two modes of production could not exclusively survive. Based on his fieldwork amongst the Dangars of the Deccan, Ajay Dandekar elaborates on the actually functioning of a pastoral economy that was dependent on agriculturists as well as forest dwellers. This is poignantly illustrated while explaining their necessity to migrate with their herds and groups from one kind of forest landscape to another. Thus, I quote, the Dangar monsoon habitations are located in an area that is characterized by dry, mixed, deciduous, and thorny forests. Scanty, precarious, and often unreliable rainfall supports vegetation of thorn forests. The migration route takes the Dangars to semi-evergreen evergreen monsoonal evergreen type of forest formations of the Western Ghats. So in presenting this case of the entanglement of communities in what he calls landscapes in conflict, the issue, a point that he's trying to address is that these communities did not have a static habitation area, but they were at this critical link between different kind of ecozones. He also takes the example of the role of the Banjara nomadic groups who linked various nuclear and marginal areas as primarily salt and grain merchants. It is said that they traded also in cattle. And in fact, Sontheimer, whom he draws upon, had suggested that the name Banjara should be derived from the term Vanachara, meaning roaming in the forests. So though the present patterns based on ethnographic studies cannot be imputed to the past in a mechanical manner, these studies do suggest that environments and spaces do not remain static or with firm borders. Not all tribes lived in the forest, an image that has been erroneously projected. Some have straddled the forest and non-forest spaces to make the above exchange possible. And this then makes it possible for us to suggest that the relationship between the Kshetra field and the Vana forest was complementary rather than in opposition. It is this shared relationship that is depicted in the visual and oral records that Sontheimer had elaborated upon while discussing various local cults during his intensive fieldwork among the pastoral communities of the Deccan. Now, I look a little at one example from archaeology, that in discussing the earliest human activities as gleaned from archaeology, Olchin points to the late Stone Age type tools in historical contexts, which he opines are suggestive of more prolonged survival of the stoneworking tradition in certain remote localities. By taking example of the stone blade industry, 5 from settled communities of the Neolithic Chalcolithic culture and 5 from the late Stone Age context of the Deccan, Olchin goes on to show direct evidence of contact between these settled people and the late Stone Age hunter-gatherers based on an analysis of tool types and the technology used to make them. His detailed observation and analysis leads him to conclude, and I quote, "The use of the same basic material, always derived from the same local sources, and possibly the same factory sites with the same basic techniques producing the same range of tools, must mean that Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and late Stone Age peoples had some fairly intimate knowledge of one another's ways," unquote. These observations are pertinent from our perspective, as they indicate that even though the late Stone Age communities of hunter-gatherers whose tools were found near rock shelters and caves had a low cultural level of habitation, they nonetheless had substantive contact with the more settled communities and otherwise culturally advanced communities of the Neolithic Chalcolithic times. The exact nature of this contact would be difficult to establish with the archaeological sources, though generally from the Neolithic Chalcolithic traditions of the Deccan, it is not difficult to find bones of domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, goat, sometimes of buffalo, pig, dog, fowl, indicating that a larger part of the population at these sites were also herders. So there is this long tradition of mixed farming in certain regions. Of course, I'm not trying to justify that this would be the same in all ecozones of the subcontinent, but definitely the basic village structure of agro-pastoralism in the Deccan would have preserved this kind of a tightly knit resource base, primarily because of the particularities of climate and landscapes that defined this region. Coming to historical periods, in the particular environs of the Deccan, apart from the archaeological and anthropological studies that I sort of drew upon earlier, scholars have tended to ignore the closed and enmeshed relationship between hunters, gatherers, pastoralists, and agriculturists, and how it is panned out during the early historical period. And over here, this is where we do not get direct narrative accounts of this, but different settlements are recorded in the earliest inscriptions, and these reflect on, and I say this carefully, they reflect on the memory of this complicated and entangled human relationship with different kinds of landscape, the deep forest, the woods, groves, fields, and gardens, so that so as to get encapsulated in place names. And of course, some of you are familiar with Professor B.D. Chattopadhyaya's work. You will know that he sort of unleashed a whole series of studies on this aspect. So the memory of an earlier landscape through these suffixes is reflected in their continued use in an agrarian setting. At some point in time, maybe these places were in vanas or in aranyas or in atavikas or vatikas or aramas or jangalas and so on and so forth. So here again, all of you, most of you would be familiar with the land grant system beginning with the 3rd century BCE, and of course dramatically increasing from around the 5th century CE. And I'm not going to go into details of what is the land grant system, but except to say that apart from information that we get on revenues that the state and intermediaries could extract, concomitantly, and this is like a very important information that comes from these inscriptions, which we do not pay too much attention to, and that is, it gives us names of particular villages and places. Either the donations were made to them or they were objects of grant themselves, and therefore these names, and I'll share with you some examples. So these nomenclatures that we have of words like gram, ur, vada, vatika, or even more urban like spaces, Durga, Nagara, Pura, Patana, etc. These are found consistently in almost all parts of the country in names of places. So for instance, and this is where I am drawing something from Professor B.D. Chattopadhyaya's work, for North India, research has shown that when both herds and crops were indicated in inscriptions, it is clearly specified by the use of specific terms like gram for rural habitation and its fields, and sometimes with the mention of gochara or grazing ground on its periphery. On the other hand, kosha was used to denote a habitation of herdsmen, which could be located near a village but distinct from it. In another context, Chattopadhyaya referring to the record of the Guhila lineage of Rajasthan, brings to our notice a settlement in the Aranya, which grew into prominence when communities here wanted to start an agara, that is the operation of a mine. So this settlement befittingly was called Aranya Kuppagiri, literally a forest product on the hill. In fact, a very dynamic process of the transformation of the localities or region's physical environment went hand in hand with the characterization of the nature of the settlement. Regional particularities were central to how these settlements underwent a change. He gives us an interesting example that illustrates the movements of the Chahmanas, an important ruling family of Rajasthan, from their seat of power at A.I.H.C. to Jangaladesha, literally country of forests, perhaps suggesting that they were colonizing a generally uncharted area. So Chattopadhyaya elaborates that this jungla had its peculiar type of trees grown in a region where water was scarce. Now, continuing this method, if we follow this method, which Professor Chattopadhyaya made all of us learn, I'll take examples from two important ruling families of the Deccan that held sway between the 4th to the 6th century CE to illustrate how suffixes and place names reflect different ecological zones of the Deccan. So, for example, the Vakataka grants were given in a region that bordered the forested areas of central India and northern Deccan, and they were interspersed with small river valleys. The other example is from the Vishnu Kundan grants, which are mainly given on the plains of eastern Andhra Pradesh, prominently the Godavari district, with very few examples on the plateau region around Hyderabad. But of course, there's one thing in common. Both these grants are describing what are called the creation of agraharas or agraharya krityam and the immunities that were attached to them. Professor K.M. Shrimali has done a critical analysis of all the Vakataka inscriptions, and of course he has his own interpretation and analysis. But one of the things that he does, which is very revealing, is that he lists for us suffixes for rural. He's trying to make the argument that the Vakataka grants are really talking about a rural economy and that this fits into the feudal mode of production and so on and so forth, and there are hardly any urban centers in this area. So he gives us the list of suffixes for rural settlements, which the first one is of course that which is suffixed by the word palli in places like Chinchalapalli, Ishtakapalli, Latakapalli, etc. And then he concludes that this refers to villages or hamlets of originally of wild tribes. Another suffix is kheta, which is a derivative from kshetra, field. And this, of course, originally indicated an enclosure where cattle were driven, like pastoral camp, and then it grew into a small village. And then there are place names like Jamala Khetka or Kinhika Khettaka, etc. These places, there are also places with Vata or Vataka or Vatika endings, and they indicate enclosures of a village consisting of a boundary of trees in places like Kumaradas Vataka or Sadavimshatika, etc. And there's a very interesting name called Vijaypalli Vataka, the last indicating that it must originally have been a tribal hamlet and then enclosed or bounded by trees. Now, if you in looking at these place names over here, it largely indicating their transition from being tribal hamlets to pastoral, sort of enclosures, and then slowly over a period of time becoming agrarian settlements. Though there is no ending grammar in any of these examples that he has cited. In the Vishnu Kundan grants, on the other hand, of course, some of you know the political history that originally they had their control over what is today the Nalgonda, Mahbubnagar areas, which has got a very rocky landscape interspersed with very few water sources. But subsequently, a majority of villages that they mention are in locations watered by the rivers Godavari, particularly the Godavari, minorly the Krishna, and the term Ur, because of course, as you know, in the Telugu language, words like Uru is for village, Eru is for streamlet, Konda is for hill, Chevuru for lake. So there are place names like Velapuru or Polomaburu to denote a village. On the other hand, there are hardly, or maybe if we think Palli should be understood as a suffix which is similar, like Valli or Balli in Kudravalli or Golavalli, or Balli as in Velam Balli. There are very few examples of the term Palli literally. Of course, from archaeology, we know of a very important place called Nelakonda Palli, literally meaning dark hill or a tribal, originally must have been a tribal hamlet. But of course, the archaeological references to this place tells us that it was a very important urban center of early historic times. So there's this lack of Palli in many of the place names. The areas contiguous to these agrarian areas were hamlets of tribes in the region that should be emphasized, because the Chenchus, the Yanadis, Koyas, Kondareddis, Shavaras, Gonds, they continued to inhabit the forested region in close proximity of the fast-growing agrarian villages in early medieval times. And then, of course, you have the suffix Vada in place names like Natavada, Kudavada, Kudavadi, etc. So here again, you have suffixes which indicate various ecological zones. And if you do a study of the inscriptions or land grants we call them land grants, but actually we should call them grants to the temple for maintenance of various things. And you will notice that the conventional unit of 55 sheep or cattle indicating a substantial pastoral input into the agrarian economy of the area. So this perception that we have from modern times to think of these as already well-established agrarian heartlands is something problematic. In fact, the inscriptions are talking about donations of sheep and cattle and not of land. And of course, in the Vishnu Kundan examples, we do have some suffixes of Nagara, Pura, and all. So the Vakataka example analysis has raised a pertinent point that land grants, in fact, had engineered a process of the acculturation of forested areas to transform them into agrarian niches. It cannot be ignored that the region around these grants were given are known from other inscriptions to be the lands that were controlled by forest chiefs. Differences between various tribal groups, frontier people, and the rest of the kingdom has been noted in the Allahabad stone pillar inscription to indicate how they were defeated or subdued in different ways. The identification of forest kingdoms as the 18 Atavika Rajyas has also been recorded. Therefore, it was probably areas like these that were transformed to become entrenched agrarian ones, a process that went hand in hand with state formation, cult formation, and the making of tribes into castes, as clearly articulated by Professor Chattopadhyaya in his introduction to his book, Making of Early Medieval India. Understanding diverse environments and the nature of their contact with multiple forests seems to have been central to this process. So in concluding, I say the following: in focusing on terms to describe the forest in early India, we submit that over a period of time, their meaning changed to allude to multiple forests that must have themselves undergone change in different historical periods. From vana being a term used to describe a foreign land in the Rig Veda, to the Arthashastra actually setting up vanas for the protection of animals, we have pointed to the complexity in its use. We have argued that the multiple contexts in which terms were used to define forest-like spaces reflect, one, that the slow domestication of the forest in border areas, which was a continuous process, and that the state and societies benefited from it. And two, that the vana be best understood as a transitory category between the deep forest and the agrarian tracts. It came to be used to define the forest proper on the one hand, and on the other to what can be referred to as woodlands, groves, gardens, depending on the contextuality of its use. In the particularity of the Deccan areas that I discussed above, to posit a binary between the two, deep forest and agrarian village, may be exaggerated. In fact, the wild space of the forest could be in close proximity to a settled domesticated environment. Concomitantly, processes of agrarian change, as reflected in a cursory study of place names, suggested that the receding frontiers of hunting, gathering, and pastoral economy. Those dependent on them were integrated into the overall social economic order as marginal communities dependent on landowning groups, while others remained outside these areas of prosperity and cohesiveness. In both cases, we illustrated to show that the locales they inhabited created new spatial and social boundaries that then necessarily had new names to define them. It goes without saying that a singular term to define all types of forest or forest-like environments was an impossibility. The memory of different ecological settings encased in place names only goes on to indicate the deep connect the natural environment had with our self-definition. So thank you very much. This is all that I have to say, and I will be happy to take a look at any questions or any doubts and any clarifications that you may need, especially since some of you missed a certain portion of what I had to say. So over to the organizers.